Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today on today's panel discussion webinar, Enabling GRC with Secure Authentication Across the Digital Ecosystem, brought to you by the IT GRC Forum. The IT GRC Forum produces educational events for the governance, risk management, and compliance community, and we provide free market intelligence to all of our members. If you're not already a member, you can register at www.executiveitforums.org. I'm Kelly Vick, the host of today's program, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Today's moderator is Colin Whitaker. Welcome back, Colin. Colin's the founder and director of Informed Risk Decisions. He's been instrumental in driving forward a risk and security strategy for payments over the last 15 years, since he retired from the military in 2001 and took up the role of head of security at Apex. In 2010, he became the VP of Payment System Risk at Visa Europe, where he sat and managed the risk appetite for all those processing and accepting card payments throughout Europe. Colin currently provides cyber and information security risk consultancy services to a wide range of public and private companies and helps solve their cyber and payment security compliance dilemmas. He's presented on information security at major events around the world and has published a number of papers on security. And on the panel, we have Teju Shamsundar, Senior Product Jared Chong, Chief Solutions Officer at Yubico, Richard Bird, Chief Customer at Ping Identity, and Andy Smith, Vice President of Product Marketing at Centrify. We'll run through a more detailed introduction with our panel in a moment, but first I'll go over the housekeeping learning objectives and the agenda for today's session. First, the webcast is streaming live and all lines will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the conference. If you have any issue with the audio, please first check your device settings before contacting technical support, and we recommend that you paste our direct landing page into a fresh browser window and close any other live windows to avoid conflicts. The direct console URLs are displayed on your screen now, and they're clickable in the attached PDF slide deck. After today's session, we'll be providing one NASBA-approved CPE credit to qualified attendees. To qualify and receive a certificate of completion for the program, we require that you've completed all fields on registration, answer all of the polls, and rate us at the end. You can participate in the polls by submitting your responses in the box below your console. Just make sure the console is not in full screen mode or you will not be able to see all of the options. Please leave us your rating and feedback through the Ratings tab, or alternatively, you can use the evaluation form attached. We value your input and suggestions. And for those who qualify for CPE credit, certificates will be issued via email within 30 days. We're also taking your questions throughout today's discussion. You can submit these at any time using the question button, and if we don't manage to answer all of your questions today, we'll respond by email. If you'd like a copy of the slides, you can download these through the Attachments tab, where you can also access the related white papers and resources at any time during the discussion. And finally, after the live presentation, this webcast will be available on demand, so please share with any colleagues who you think may be interested in the topic, and watch your email for announcements about other upcoming webcasts, which you can also find listed on executiveitforums.org. Our learning objectives today are to gain insights on evaluating security requirements against newer online attacks, sharing insights across security systems to strengthen security, consolidating and evolving authentication methods, how MFA can transform secure access to any application from any device, anywhere, at any time, the concept of zero trust in strengthening identity management with privileged users. Moving on to the agenda. We'll begin with speaker introductions before running over some executive tips recommended by our panel, and then we'll dive into the Q&A discussion facilitated by Colin before closing with takeaways and further information at the end. So now, without further ado, I will go ahead and turn the program over for today's discussion. So over to you, Colin.
Kelly, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, everyone. To start with, we'll run around the table, or the virtual table here, and hear from each of our panelists. I'm going to invite them to tell us a little bit about themselves, their organizations, so that everyone listening today, that's either you guys at the end of the line or people listening in on the archives, can better understand our panelists' frame of reference and what their particular interests are when they're talking today. To start off, so we'll start with Richard. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Colin. I appreciate that. My background is a little strange in the scale and breadth of diversity that I've experienced in the course of my working career. I spent 20+ years in the corporate sector, first in IT executive management, and then ultimately in information security. Moved from a CIO position and then became a CISO a few years ago, and after several years in the corporate sector, decided I wanted to try and solve problems relative to security from a different set of platforms. So I moved into security solutions. And as a result, I spent about 50% of my time advocating for identity-centric solutions around the world. I work closely with organizations like the Berlin Group in London around open banking, as well as open banking initiatives down in Australia, and GDPR and CCPA and all that type of work here in the United States. And thoroughly enjoy it, and that's a bit of my background. Most of that time was spent in banking in terms of the corporate side.
Well, thank you, Richard. You and I have many common interests, it's clear on that. So next up, Andy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing there at Centrify?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Andy Smith. I run marketing for Centrify. Been in Silicon Valley for about 30 years, various startups, most recently at Oracle in their identity and security practice there. I call myself 2 for 5 in startups. Anyway, glad to be here.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. So I'm over to you then, Gerard. Can you share us a little bit about where you're coming from today?
Yes, thank you, Colin. I've been actually with Yubico for over 5 years, and I've actually seen the company grow from early days to where it is today. I run the solutions team and architecture team for the company. We've done a lot of things to help customers, but also we've done a lot of things to work with our technology partners. In fact, all the panelists here were from Ping, Okta, and Centrify are great Yubico partners, and our goal is to make sure that we create the best solution that helps our customers meet their security and authentication challenges for the global market.
Well, thank you, Gerard. And last but definitely not least, Teju, please can you tell us something about what you're doing over there at Okta?
Yeah, sure, Colin. Hi, everyone. I'm Teju. So most of my experience so far has been both in the identity and mobility space. So previously, before Okta, I was at Microsoft for about 5 years. In that role, I was in a customer-facing role where I was helping customers architect and implement enterprise mobility solutions across identity, security, and devices. And then in my current role at Okta, my focus is more on identity-driven security, so things that you hear about like multi-factor authentication, risk-based authentication, as well as the technologies that we partner with in that space.
Well, thank you for that. Indeed, Teju, it's great to have you on the panel, and I'm looking forward to some of your insights today from the work you're doing at Okta. Okay, everyone out there. So to kick things off, we've put our panelists on the panel, and we've asked them to identify some quick tips for you, the audience, which we would recommend. And they are based around, first of all, considering what your cybersecurity architecture should look like if you put a person instead of an asset in the center of that architecture. Implementing the concept of zero trust by assuming the attacker is already on your network, which broadly is a very sound idea indeed. Following best practices for authentication, what they might be, reducing your attack surface via automation, and enabling rapid detection and response. And I'm going to invite each of our panelists to talk a little bit about those quick tips. We're going to start with Richard. So, Richard, can you paint a picture for us on what a cybersecurity architecture may look like with a person in the middle as opposed to an asset? I think it's a pretty new, novel idea for a lot of people and organizations, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Within the age of digital transformation, it's a novel concept. This notion of protecting people instead of let me rephrase that: protecting people first and assets second. Except within the analog, for literally thousands of years, it has been the basis of security. We protect human beings. It's the very structure of security until we reached the digital age. And the reason that the digital age started out a bit differently is because assets themselves were isolated and air-gapped by design. So when we started out in the era of beginnings of computing, those were mainframe systems that were completely isolated, not only by network, but also isolated by foreign language, Fortran and COBOL. So you needed to have special expertise in order to be able to manage those assets. And then, ultimately we went to network systems, and then, we've gravitated towards a space where networks have almost become, not to sound negative on this, but irrelevant relative to data and applications because of the advent of the cloud. And in all of this, we've never really changed our security structures to reflect the fact that we built perimeters and walls and used keys and encryptions to protect the things. And now as we look at what's happening with cyber losses are not decreasing, they're accelerating. And interestingly enough, if for our folks that are on the line, if you think about the news of the last 3 years or so, there's been virtually no news of a major bank breach of any size or scale, except there have been massive breaches of identity-related data, accounts, systems, and now huge efforts on parts of hackers for credential stuffing. And why is that? Because by attacking through the assumption of somebody's personal identity online, they're able to do more damage and acquire more gain. Remember, hackers are economically driven. Even if those economics aren't tied to dollars, they might be tied to destruction. And as a result of that, they're being very, very successful in these guerrilla warfare tactics against traditional warfare defenses, because you just assume an identity, become somebody that you're not, to sneak into systems or inside of organizations that you do not belong to get things that don't belong to you and leave, and many times today, in today's age, without anybody knowing about it. So one of the things that's interesting in the course of speaking about this around the world is I asked that simple question: what if you just put a stick figure in the middle of your security architecture? What begins to change? And a lot of things begin to change. Data protection and monitoring, threat vulnerability management, firewall management. As we begin to take a human-centric focus on security, a lot of things change substantially. And that's really the notion of putting that person in the middle.
Well, thank you for that, Richard. I think that's a very sound observation. We might come back to that later when we look at some of the questions and also get some feedback from the audience out there on that concept. Andy, the concept of zero trust assumes the attacker is already on your network. So how would you recommend that we go about implementing zero trust? And particularly, I'd be interested if you believe there's any ways that automation can help solve some of those problems of implementing a zero trust environment.
It's absolutely part of the zero trust concept and the architecture. First off, this analogy that I present here is, zero trust all starts with assuming the attacker is already on your network, and we know that's the case. Depending on the study you read, on average of 90 to 120 days, attackers on your network before being realized. So not trusting the network and making sure, how would you architect your security if you assume the attacker is already there? And the analogy is, how would you protect your family if you assume the attacker is already in the house, right? So yes, we have locks on windows and doors, exterior doors to get in, but if the attacker is already in your house, you would have locks on bedrooms, have more security procedures in place, cameras inside, right? And so understanding what's going on already inside your network is basically the concept of zero trust. And a great place to start is about access. It actually dovetails on what Richard just talked about. I need to be able to tie identities to the data. Where's my sensitive data? What users or accounts have access to that data? And then it's all about validating that user or validating that identity, understanding the context of the access request, and then being able to enforce least privilege, where the use of machine learning or artificial intelligence and dynamic access controls is exactly that. If I understand the context of that request, what's going on with that device, the laptop that user's utilizing, where are they located when they're making this request? Is that unusual for them? Understanding all that context, what are they asking for access to? Have they ever asked for that before? Does that make sense given their role? All that context can be used to understand user behavior, what's normal, what's abnormal, and you can make dynamic access decisions now, today, with machine learning technologies that you couldn't make 5 years ago.
Well, thank you, Andy. I think it's, as you say, a very clear synergy between what you're saying and what Richard's saying about the people in the space. And I'm sure that will come through as well from what Gerald and Teju will have to say as well. Jared, let's go back to the core of the question about authentication. I think it goes without saying that we should all try and implement best practices when it comes to authentication. But the key question is, what do you think are the best practices that you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the key ideas that we've continued to wrestle around is identity, and what is the first pillar that we think about when you need to identify who the user is authentication. And one of the things that we've started to see across many experiences that our users have, our customers have, our partners have, is that if you make authentication difficult, no matter how secure it is, you're not going to be successful. So one of the fundamental things that needs to change from an industry perspective, we shouldn't make authentication to really identify the user difficult. So it must be on the journey to provide equal amount of focus on usable security, right? So one of the big things that I call out for is that whatever we implement to get the information that you need to make a good decision, a good risk-based decision, is to not make it difficult for the user. So it should be as transparent as possible and as usable as possible. We start to see that this can only be achieved if actually everybody focus on making the security elements of multi-factor authentication usable. And you do need to strongly authenticate the user, probably at the beginning of the journey. And then you can use other signals to make sure you maintain that. And for us, it's very important to consider these elements of evolution of where we are from the industry. I mean, we've seen the authentication space evolve from sort of very difficult sort of tasks you ask the users to do to sort of more easier tasks to do, which is, you can think of using the onboard biometrics of your device and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it's very important that these elements are standardized. So I'll talk more about it later, but there are many new techniques now that we can use, but they're all foundationally is being enabled because of open standards for authentication. We've come a long way. The FIDO standards, together with web authentication, is sort of a global scale authentication standard that everyone can implement and really get scale, because that was built on the founding principle of usability, security, and privacy.
Gerard, thanks for that. I think there's a clear synergy between what you're saying and what Richard's saying. I mean, particularly as your key recommendation around making authentication usable to end users is exactly what Richard's talking about, but people at the center of the equation. So again, I think we've got some positive messages to come through there. So before we go on to look at the more detailed questions of the QA, I'm going to turn to Teju. Andy's already touched on the benefits of automation, Teju, but can you tell us a little bit more about how you think automation can help us reduce the attack surface? And also, what are your recommendations when it comes to enabling rapid detection and response?
Yeah, so I think automation can exist in a few different ways. So there's basically different workflows on which you can apply automation. The first one is just like policy definition across the enterprise. So when you have a centralized identity solution, one thing that becomes much easier is to provide a consistent login experience regardless of where end users are logging in from. So it could be mobile device or a desktop, but could also be a native mobile app or a web browser. So when you're able to automate that, it's much easier for both the administrator as well as the end user. And then the second place that you can really benefit from automation is for what we call like joiner, mover, and leaver processes. So this is when someone is onboarding, offboarding, and moving to a new role within the company. That by which automation helps here is just to reduce the likelihood that a user has access to an application that they shouldn't have access to. So when you automate the tasks of app assignment and app entitlement, you're reducing the likelihood that someone has, let's say, admin permissions in an application that they shouldn't have admin permissions to. So that, again, that helps increase the level of security in your organization. And then lastly, once you do have that centralized identity solution that covers the 4 items that you see here, so intelligent MFA, secure authentication through SSO, reducing the attack surface, and secure access to APIs, that really puts you in a spot where you can export all of the identity events that are happening across the organization into something like a SIM, SOAR, or CASB, so that you can both detect and remediate any anomalies that you see across the enterprise automatically.
Thanks for that, Teju. That's really good. That's going to be really good, some good insights there about how automation can help. And I actually concur with a lot of things you're saying about automating the processes for leaders and joiners. That's absolutely the right thing to do. So I think that those quick tips really set things up nicely for the discussion. So we're going to pause here on the slide with everyone's headshot. So I think it's important that everyone gets this picture of who we are, our titles and affiliations, so that they can, listening today, can put a face to the voices that they're listening to. And everyone out there listening in the audience land, I do want to remind you, this is very much an interactive conversation that we're having with the panelists. And we've got some great talent assembled on the panel, so please don't be shy. Use the question tab liberally. I'll be monitoring it as we go forward, and I'll be trying to feed your questions in with my other seed questions to the audience, to the panelists, and try and get their response. So let's get things started on the Q&A and let's start working forward. So Richard, we'll start with yourself. What's wrong with this statement, or what might be right with the statement about identity is the new perimeter?
A favorite topic of mine. My short answer to that is one that I share on a number of conference speaking podiums regularly, which is if we believe in that statement that identity is the new perimeter, then we have to believe that Bob in accounting is the new port 80. Right? So there's two problems with the identity as the perimeter, the new perimeter argument. The first is that if we kind of pull this back to just standard information security terminologies, I would much rather manage 1,000 poorly managed firewall rules than 10,000 human beings that are all a point of entry to my network relative to risk. So, you know, if we associate a human being with a perimeter, we also do something that is, you know, the second point to the problem with the statement, which is we actually dehumanize the human. You know, we suggest that, you know, they're the pikemen on the outside of the outside of that asset, and as opposed to the most important thing that we see on the sides of buses and on the sides of airplanes and on the sides of, you know, semi-trucks that say our people are the most important thing. You know, so it's an emotional response from our user population, whether they be workforce or customers, when we suggest that there's something other than the core of security. And how we ever got lost relative to, you know, assigning a peripheral role to humans, I can't really say. That goes well beyond, you know, the entire information security architecture discussion. We somehow have decided that more universally and globally that people are secondary to the security function. Except when you look at the metrics, and I find it fascinating, when you look at the metrics year over year, Forrester, Gartner, all of those, 80 to 85% of all breaches can be tied directly back to usurped credentials. 80 to 85% of breaches are because the bad guys know that identity is the core of security, not the new perimeter. And if they know it's the core, we better start understanding it's the core as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there. I mean, I think one of the concerns I would have is that the statement doesn't reflect that actually the biggest value of entropy in any system is the human dimension, and you have to keep reinforcing and making the human dimension work, and you have to make sure that the entropy in the human dimension actually declines less than it does normally, or else your security is going to weaken substantially. So I absolutely agree with everything you said there. Andy, we've heard a lot about zero trust, and you mentioned some very good definitions about it, about what it is. But why is it so prolific an issue now?
Yeah, it's actually been around for you know, just over a decade now. It started back, Jericho Institute talked about the deperimeterization of the network. Of course, you know, that just doesn't roll off your tongue like zero trust does, deperimeterization. But what's going on now is, you know, one, just everybody's more aware of the breaches because of information availability, but the actual attack surfaces changed. So back when, you know, it was servers, databases, you know, network devices, applications inside your four walls, you had all those perimeter controls, et cetera, available. Now that you've got workloads moving to the cloud, they're, you know, outside of your network, I'm having big data where I'm storing more data than ever before, DevOps practices where everything is automated, and containers where an application used to be a single entity. It could be hundreds or thousands of containers and microservices now. So the things you need to protect have increased. So for all those reasons, your attack surface has changed, and zero trust has been gaining popularity because of that changing attack surface. Richard mentioned that 80% of breaches involve some kind of credential abuse. I like to say that attackers no longer hack in, or hackers no longer hack in; they log in. Right? It's much easier for them to compromise a credential and get in. And so, zero trust. It's not that you shouldn't, look at endpoint security and all the other aspects of perimeter security, but you need to not ignore that they're going to be on your network already, and trying to prevent that initial compromise is tough. Then I need layers of security, like has always been talked about. So why is zero trust popular now? One, because you're hearing about breaches a lot more, and then two, the attack surface has changed. I mean, we're spending more and more than ever on security, but yet you still hear of every other day about a new major breach.
Thanks, Andy. I think we're going to test the waters about how much people know about it in the next poll. So everyone out there in audience land, it's trying to bring you into the game for our first poll of the day. We'd like your feedback, so please check your response in the options below your console. Just make sure you're not in full screen mode, or you won't be able to see the poll. And remember that participation is required. The poll is very simple. What's your level of familiarity with zero trust? And there are a number of options there, and we'll come back to that answer a little later. And I'll invite Andy to comment on the observations. So while that's going on, and the poll will be active for about a minute, we'll bring in Teju. Teju, in specifics about authentication and access, are there any specific access points that we should be most concerned about? For example, cloud apps versus legacy apps versus servers versus privileged access. Where would you place the effort?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's hard to actually identify what is considered a critical application today. So we were just talking about zero trust a second ago, so the concept of never trust, always verify. And so if you are taking that approach to identity and security, you would want to assume that basically any app at this point is considered a critical app. And the reason for that is that it can be accessed from anywhere. So regardless of whether it's a cloud application or an on-prem application that maybe you're exposing over the internet or a server, you should really consider all resources as critical resources and apply definitely multi-factor authentication, but other security policies as well. But there are some cases where specific apps may require an additional layer of security, or maybe even a more secure type of multi-factor authentication. For example, like, let's just say email, right? I mean, email is something that we all access every day, and it actually holds more sensitive data than what people actually assume. And so maybe for something like email, you would enforce a more phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication method. But the net of it is that I would say that basically any application that you're exposing over the internet should be considered critical.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because one of the key issues in Europe at the moment, particularly in the payment space, and Richard may be familiar with this as well, is that the European regulators dealing with payments have regulated that strong multi-factor authentication, and they do mean strong multi-factor authentication as defined in all the glossaries, is used to access and to secure banking information and for making payment transactions. So certainly it may become a regulatory requirement out there, particularly on internet-facing applications more widely in the future, because what Europe does now, the rest of the world soon follows, doesn't it, as we've seen with GDPR. So let's have a look at the poll results. Andy, can I bring you in here briefly just to have a quick look at them? It's very interesting that the vast majority of people seem to be sort of heard the buzz, can define it, but that's about it. There's only a few organizations that started on the journey on actually implementing it. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is pretty typical. It's getting out there, but it's in its infancy. So even though it's been around a while, as far as a real implementations, there are some very well broadcast solutions out there. So Google's Beyond Corp initiative, every user having access to any resource without the use of a VPN was their mission statement. They achieved that about 2 years ago. So there are plenty of companies that are actually well down the path, but for the most part, this is a new concept. And the great thing is it's a journey, right? So it's not a 1 year implementation thing. It's a more of a philosophical approach, and then very practical measures that combine a lot of controls that have been around a long time. But it's taking a more identity-centric view of security, so combining identity and security together.
Well, in that sense, one of the questions that we got from one of the audience was, and here I'll give you a quick answer to say yes or no, whether you agree with it. They've actually opined that actually wouldn't zero trust begin to protect one's right to privacy definition of Civil Rights Act, and particularly within the GDPR, as the baseline, and therefore be imperative to implement that sort of strategy in any organization which has personal information in it. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I think it is very similar concepts in the sense that the right to privacy, GDPR regulations, et cetera, allows an individual to control what is exposed or not around that, and it's very similar. I mean, it's kind of a least privilege model, and that same type of access controls implies inside your network. I mean, it's basically segmenting access to the data, and you either have rights or not. It's all about understanding where your sensitive data is, where it flows, and then binding those user identities to that data in a least privilege model.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for coming in there. Gerard, I'm sorry we digressed with Andy there for a moment, but I think it was important to reflect on those responses. So over to you, Gerard. Multi-factor authentication has been around for a significant period of time, many years now. So what's new today? What are some of the considerations you think organizations need to take account for in their implementations?
Absolutely. I want to tie in a couple of the topics on zero trust as well, and what Richard and Andy's talked about. Actually, even what Teju talked about.
Please do so.
So when Andy talked a little bit about Google's Beyond Trust model, and one of the basic fundamental principles and a tenet for them to achieve that successful model was to implement an MFA strategy that they could really be proud of and sort of protect against the more modern attacks. And they implemented the FIDO U2F standard. If you look and read the reviews in the press, they had zero attacks compromises once they implemented that model with what we believe today is the most secure MFA option today. And to talk about what is the most common attack. So we talked about MFA needs to evolve. We talked about identity is really everybody's just grabbing credentials. So what is the most common attack today? The most common, effective, cheapest attack today is a phishing attack. You don't need to have, a whole team of a swarm of people that are PhD thesis writers and create special code. It's very easy to phish a user. Between credential stuffing, taking a whole bunch of credentials from a server and phishing a user, damage for any organization because you're using the legitimate credential of the user. So what needs to happen today is we need to implement MFA solutions that can take care of the most basic, common, modern attacks, which is phishing and man in the middle. And that comes to play a lot of techniques that we have tried in the past actually do not solve that problem. You could think of schemes like using SMS, for example, even codes, OTP codes. Those are not phishing resistant. The fact that you can easily phish a user to review the username and password, it is as easy to ask the user to review the OTP codes that they just received on their phone. So we need to evolve that conversation right away, which is look at the modern attacks, what are the defenses to these modern attacks. And the good news is that, the work that we've started way back with Google, we call the Security Key Initiative, is based on the FIDO E2F standard. Now it's evolved to FIDO 2 with implementation from Microsoft. And then web authentication now is actually available for sort of everyone to implement, built into the standard operating systems of our modern devices. So what needs to change is to use new tools to defend against, new attacks. And it's like, what we say about we need to provide a strong signal to the risk engine. Now, if the first time you try to authenticate a user and that's not strong, then you depend on all these other things that you try to make sure as the user. And we believe if you start strong, then you can maintain the level of assurance for the user, and you can do more interesting things while you go about making sure you protect other assets in the organization. So to us, it's important to evolve the conversation. The great news today is that you have an open standard with FIDO 2 and web authentication to help you mitigate these common phishing attacks that honestly can be very sophisticated. Anybody can create a very, very, very compelling website or an app that looks like the real one and just grab all the credentials. So by using modern techniques with the new modern open standards, we really can achieve the next level of what we believe of authentication to get to strong user identification.
Gerard, thank you very much indeed for that. And thank you for supporting what Richard and Andy were talking about there. So everyone out there in audience land, we're going to pause for poll number 2, which you should see under your console now. And this is a very simple question, a binary question. For those of you who are customer-facing organizations and consumer-facing organizations, is consumer multi-factor authentication on your roadmap in the next 3 years? Remember to submit your responses to get your credits, and we'll leave the poll open for about a minute, and while we wait for the results, we'll turn to Richard. So, Richard, beyond authenticating access to applications, what other types of access do you think should be authenticated?
Well, realistically, all types of access, right? We talk about, access, and we abstract it from the realities of the human intersect. People walk into a digital environment through their login, and then they walk out through their log out. And in many cases, the problems that we see that get created are problems where a user, a customer, a partner, a vendor have continuing persistent access, right? They're just in session all of the time. And that is that's a recipe for disaster, because there's no authentication that occurs in today's world outside of the entry point, and we don't authenticate on the exit point either. And again, these are so foreign relative to the way that humans actually transact in the real world, that it begs the question, why don't we apply those same standards? A great example that I like to use, relative to zero trust is this model has existed again for decades, if not centuries. If you go to Fort Knox in the United States here and ask to see the gold vaults that are contained within that military base, even as the President of the United States, you'll be checked anywhere from 8 to 10 times for your credentials to verify that you are who you are. So all the way through your session and accessing the most valuable assets, within that particular site, you get checked multiple times and you get checked out. So the reality is that authentication not only has to happen across all of these different intersects, whether it be authentication on the device or authentication, at the mobile handset, authentication at the physical building. We're starting to see collapses of physical security into information security organizations, into a global security office in many companies, because every place where authentication does not happen represents the exploit opportunity within your company. And I think it's really important to remember that, and I'm noticing this in a question that I see here, that all of the things that are used to verify you are an attribute that are associated to you. So MFA is not the end of security. MFA is only the beginning of security. There are other attributes that are happening relative to verification to who you are and are you who you say you are. all throughout your interaction within the digital realm and again through the physical transect. The challenge is how do we build systems that do that in a way that is frictionless so that people aren't having to constantly have to authenticate, physically or actively. Going back to Jared's statement, if you make it a friction-filled event, it will not be followed by the user. But how do we do it in a way that is using intelligence in the back end to be able to continuously verify in session using data that's available to us through all of these verifiable attributes?
Very good question. I have my perspective of frictionless authentication as well, which I think is important. But I think there are times, and increasingly, where it's going to become more of a challenge to allow frictionless authentication with the constraints that people like regulators may expect to see in place, which is going to be a real challenge on the user experience. With your background in banking experience, similar to my own, perhaps you'd like to comment on the votes from the audience, where we can see that 71% of people of the audience are considering consumer MFA in their roadmap in the next 3 years, with 28% not doing so. What's your view on that response? Richard?
No, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, I was just going to get the response of the poll. We've got 71% of people who are putting MFA on their roadmap for consumers in the next 3 years, with 28 not. Do you think that's a reasonable reflection of what you're seeing in the marketplace?
I would say kind of, sort of. The reason is because there's a big differentiation across markets, right? So in the United States, I would say that number would be not representative of where I see the markets going, as opposed to the European continent and Australia. And the reason is because there's a pending set of mandates relative to open banking, PSD2, that are really driving a conversation around securitized customer access and expectation of protecting the customer, not just their data. And that demand is quickly coming to bear in barring federal elections in Australia and some strange turn there in spring of next year. I know the EU standards are still being worked out, but it is certainly a top of mind expectation for securitization of the customer experience in those markets. In the United States, there's still a lot of economic and market tension around how to accomplish it, how to manage it. In the U.S., there's also concerns about the extension of liability on end user behaviors. I do think that those will all get resolved as we're starting to see a lot of traction around federal data protection requirements in the U.S. But I would say that that would be a peak number for those markets and not necessarily for the American continent. Thanks
for that. You've covered a lot of things I would have liked to have covered there in relation to PSD2, but I think it's going to become an increasing requirement for a lot of people out there. So thank you for that. Andy, I'd like to turn to yourself now. You've talked about perimeterless enterprises and zero trust and the diverse digital landscape. Can you say, in that sort of environment, can you say how you are seeing privileged access evolve and meet the requirements of these zero trust environment? Andy, are you there? I think Andy has just
dropped off the call. I'm here. I'm here.
Thank you, Andy.
No problem. Privileged access management, privileged access control has been around for decades and decades. But as we explained earlier, the changing attack surface is requiring those privileged access controls to evolve. So where it used to be purely humans logging into servers, utilizing shared accounts, the credentials they used were passwords. That was kind of it. And so you put best practices would put those passwords in a password vault and rotate them on a regular basis, etc. With these new attack surfaces, with cloud, big data, DevOps, containers, etc. Now it's not just humans logging in; it's machines talking to each other. It's services, it's APIs. In addition to shared accounts, best practices are now use your individual identity, your individual ID. Even those machines have identities. The policy has to be dynamic and risk aware. As I talked about earlier, you can make those access decisions dynamically. You know, passwords are not good enough anymore. We've been talking about MFA all throughout the session, right? Today, that certainly is the best practice, and it's not just you know, people logging into servers. You know, the privileged access management providers need to not only care about, you know, Unix, Linux, Windows, but additional now AWS and Azure and Google and Kubernetes and Docker, et cetera. And so the integrations that a privileged access solution provider has to do are many and different in today's world. And all that now says, hey, kind of legacy PAM's not good enough anymore. You need to move to more what we call a zero trust privilege model.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen that with people adopting the cloud-based solutions and operating software as a service, cloud-based infrastructure. Some of these software solutions and the admin rights that people have within them start to become part of the privileged access environment because of what they can do to your business, can't they?
Absolutely, yeah. Those, and it's not just sysadmins and DBAs anymore. You know, application admins are privileged users.
Yeah, absolutely right, because of what they can do to the business, particularly the more you rely on software as a service within these environments. Okay, so we're now going to go to another audience poll for everyone out there, and I know some of you had difficulties finding some of them, but I think those issues have been resolved now. So the next audience poll for you is, has your organization implemented a centralized identity and access management solution? Please again select your response in the box below the console. It'll stay active for a minute and we'll come back to the response in the moment. While you're doing that, Teju, what are a few important considerations that companies should be looking for when choosing an identity solution? Do you think there are any go-to requirements that you would particularly wish to stress?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is just to make sure that you're choosing a solution that can scale with the growth of your business, right? And so in most cases, what that means is that you're choosing a solution that is either cloud-based or is large or has a cloud offering. It's much easier to scale that way when you don't have to worry about things like server downtime, maintenance, you know, like patching servers, updating the operating systems, and that type of thing. I think that's the first item. And the second is just for whatever identity solution that you're choosing, ensuring that it goes past just the basic single sign-on, right? So single sign-on is just one component of how you can secure yourselves with identity. So we saw on the executive tip slide from a couple of minutes ago, kind of the 4 to 5 main points there. And so secure authentication with single sign-on was one of them, but then you also had multi-factor authentication, you know, automation through things like lifecycle management and secure access to APIs. So with the solution that you're choosing, you want to see what it can do for you past just that initial single sign-on and integrated directory experience to some more advanced topics like multi-factor authentication and other types of automation.
I've got a question for you, because one of the one of the audience asked a question about, what do you say to someone who says that single sign-on isn't secure?
I saw that one. So that's an interesting question. So there's a couple of different benefits for single sign-on across both the administrators as well as IT, right? So one of the main benefits for single sign-on is just ease of use for end users. So what that also ultimately results in help desk calls for things like password reset. You can have improved security because there are less credentials at risk. But then on top of single sign-on, this pretty much goes in line with what I was saying before. MFA goes hand in hand with single sign-on. So while single sign-on is important to reduce that password sprawl and password fatigue across your end users, you really want to think about what you're going to do in the next step, and that should be implementing multi-factor authentication.
Well, we'll come on to that in a moment to see what actually people are doing. In the meantime, Teju, we have the results of the whether people have implemented a centralized identity and access management solution. Perhaps I could invite you, Teju, to offer some comments on the observations. It seems that well over, I'm doing my sums in my head here, 70% of people have actually implemented or are implementing an on-prem or cloud-based solution. I think that's very promising. Would you tend to agree with that?
Yeah, it's great to see that. It looks like most have some type of identity solution in place, whether it's on-prem or cloud-based. So I think, again, the next step, like we've been talking about, is what are you going to do past just the single sign-on piece of it?
That's fine, thanks. I think it's a good response to that. I'm encouraged to see that. And while we are on the topic, I think it's important to turn to our next final poll, actually. And again, this is a relatively straightforward one, which will complement some of the discussion we've already had today, which was, has your organization already deployed multi-factor authentication? And once again, choose your response below the console, and it'll stay active for about a minute. So in the meantime, while you're all doing that, we'll turn to Gerard. Gerard, what are some of the best authentication approaches for FIPS 142 and or DFARS compliance? And perhaps, if I could invite you, perhaps you might want to say something about the implications of authentication approaches in relationship to the NIST cybersecurity framework.
Absolutely. In fact, they're all connected discussions. So one of the things that we look at collectively in the industry is about when you implement a new the open abilities to interact, is compliance do you. And the good news is that as we work through a couple of these open standards initiatives, we actually brought in the policymakers in the same discussions. And I would say that today, if you look at 140-2 or they all reference very carefully the new, both the cybersecurity framework, but also the NIST digital guidance, SP 863-3, that talks about how do we actually protect digital identities online. And why is that so important? Because now you have compliance, regulation, providing guidance to industry based on best practices that the open standards community have been advocating for. So we tie everything together, which means that if you actually implement some of these new authentication techniques, not only will you be more secure, help your users, but you actually be in compliance as well. In the digital guidance 863-3, there's a specific call out for sort of FIDO web authentication type, a new category they call single-factor cryptographic devices and multi-factor cryptographic devices that needs to meet certain new criteria. And one of the new criteria is actually being able to be more phishing resistant. And therefore, at the same time, they've also provided guidance to de-emphasize other techniques that they used to approve, for example, SMS, as now the not a safe option for MFA. So we see policy adopting and evolving as new techniques and standards evolve, which is excellent because you don't have to implement the latest and greatest and then not be in compliance, which is sort of a very ironic situation, but it does happen as we've seen in the industry. This time around, we've done a lot of due diligence to make sure that those are aligned, so that when you're using the latest and greatest techniques and technology, you actually can be in compliance.
Well, thank you for that, Gerard. It's interesting points you made there. I mean, we've also got the poll that's been running there. I noticed that from the poll, Gerard, that 2/3 of our audience have actually already deployed the MFA. I think you would agree with me that that's a very positive sign, wouldn't you?
It is a very positive sign. I think the awareness of why we need MFA is absolutely at sort of fever pitch because of all the breaches. But I do want to call out, not all MFA are equal, right? So when someone says I've implemented MFA, I'm like, well, if you haven't really adopted your MFA strategy to take care of the common new modern attacks, then would you consider the MFA solution in place successful? I would consider that not successful because we haven't addressed the evolving threat vectors coming from the attackers. So I would say that this is a positive, very encouraging sign, but I would ask everyone who's implemented MFA today to make sure that the MFA solution in place can really address the common attacks that we see that are, again, very sophisticated, very cheap, and very, very effective. So we want to make sure that we don't sort of have a false sense of security. I've gone to customers and they're like, you know what, we're done. We have MFA solved and everybody can get an SMS text. And their users are traveling overseas and they don't get SMS, and it's a productivity problem, it's a security problem, and ultimately they have a false sense of security. So I would encourage audience to look at the MFA solutions you have in place, make sure they do withstand some of the modern attacks and evolve. I mean, MFA is not like, I believe Teju mentioned it, it's not like, or even Andy mentioned, it's not like you just look at it once and then you move on. Like, this is a continual journey for the entire industry, and you got to pay attention.
I'd absolutely agree with you. I mean, my particular experience has been in MFA in relationships to the consumer experience in banking. And even when we saw it being implemented all those years ago, back as far as 2003 and 4, we saw the criminals evolve attack techniques which had to require the banks who were deploying that solutions to evolve and improve their MFA capabilities in response to the prevailing threats. You know, what comes around goes around, and criminals will always find a way to defeat some of these MFA solutions. So your point is well made in response to always monitoring the marketplace of attack vectors out there. Richard, I'd like to turn to you, if I may, to give you an opportunity to respond. We talk about authentication being predominantly an internal application with internal authentication authorities. So there's an increasing number of global authentication authorities. So where do you think these global authentication authorities might fit into an enterprise's authentication infrastructure?
Sure. It's definitely early days relative to the concept of global authentication authorities. We're seeing, again, a lot of differentiation across a number of different geographies. So if we look at a place like Norway, with the development and the growth of the bank ID, which probably is going to serve as an example for digital unique ID in the EU, the global authentication authority approach taken there has created a situation where 4 million Norwegian citizens are able to get government services, verify themselves, from a banking standpoint, health insurance standpoint, government services standpoint, all through that authentication authority and the aggregation of, again, those verifiable attributes as associated to a unique citizen with an encrypted back end, which is an interesting design. The challenges that we run into with global authentication authorities when we start to move into, say, the United States is there's a tremendous amount of resistance in the U.S. for the aggregation of a unique digital identity into a global authentication authority. So we're seeing global authentication authorities being developed by large corporations that are saying, I want one identity store for everyone, for my customers, for my employees, my retirees, my partners, my vendors, because their use cases are so tied together. You might have an airline would have a pilot who's retired but still has flight rights and is asked to pick up a flight in a different city by a friend. Now he becomes an active employee, but you don't want him peeking in a cockpit, in his home city, when he's not supposed to be there. So those types of use cases are creating this business need for these global authentication authorities. But rolling that up even further into a verifiable authentication authority that would be at the large nation state level runs into all kinds of challenges relative to culture and history, certain degrees of paranoia, concern, justified or unjustified within the population about who holds that data. It's a little bit interesting in the United States because all that data already exists. And in some cases, if you're a great example, if you've signed up for the Global Entry Program in the United States, it's already aggregated in an authentication authority. But it's still culturally a bit of a challenge here in the U.S., but it's definitely becoming more the norm, say, in the EU as well as Australia, and certainly not so much kind of in the APAC region. That's a region that has not really gravitated towards those constructs, also because of culture and history. So we're starting to see it develop. the question becomes, who's the holder of that information? Who becomes the trusted entity? If you build them from a corporate standpoint, it makes sense, to manage one identity store to rule them all. But when we get into nation state, it gets a lot more challenging, and those issues won't be hashed out, for the next couple of years.
I absolutely agree with you. I was involved in lobbying and supporting and looking at the UK Identity Card program. At the heart of the Identity Card program was the inherent capability to use it online as a UK authentication authority to access government services and other services, and it never flew because people didn't like it. So culturally, there are major challenges with any form of global authentication authority. And I think, yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, Colin, the concept that, evolving technology, obviously is super buzzwordy, but blockchain and, identity, blockchain-based identity, and it can be, look at this issue, which is, can I have various holders of certain parts of my identity that can be validated rather than one single global authority? So lots of discussion there. It's a long ways away still, but there's a technology, some people would say technology looking for a problem, but there's a technology that is possible that could address some of this problem.
And it's the whole blockchain approach in this space is very similar to a significant initiative that was introduced to me nearly 20 years ago by a major global IT provider, which was a similar sort of strategy, but that never took off either because people couldn't see how they would invest in it or use it or understand the use case scenario. So it's interesting space to be in this area. Andy, while we're talking, what are the issues you see with access and identity with customers running into on their cloud transformation journeys? Are there any particular issues that you see out there that they are coming up against?
Definitely. One of the biggest issues we see actually relates to the earlier poll about having a centralized identity store. We saw the majority on there has an on-prem identity store, which I'm sure is mostly Active Directory based. And what you'll find is many companies spent a lot of money and a lot of time putting together these centralized identity stores. And then the move to the cloud can all of a sudden start creating another identity silo. So I start to create duplicate identities in AWS or in Azure, which does a better job of integrating with your on-prem ID, or in Google Cloud, et cetera. And so, let's not make the mistakes we have in the past and start creating a bunch of new identity silos. But the problem that customers run into is, if I have a on-prem based identity store, how do I utilize that in my cloud-based environment without duplicating? And so there's various ways to go approach that, to utilize a cloud-based one, to put a site-to-site VPN in, which is expensive, to kind of replicate that on-prem store into the cloud, which has its own issues, et cetera, to broker authentication from your cloud resources out to wherever your identity stores are. So lots of various solutions, but that's definitely one of the issues that customers run into. Yeah, let's move to the cloud. I put workloads up there. Oh crap, do I have to create a whole bunch of new identities out on this cloud resource, or how do I get that back to utilize that identity store? So something to think about before you just start moving workloads.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, some of these silos that people are creating and then worrying about it afterwards. I could tell you at length about the identity silos in some UK banks with consumers, which is really fast-paced. But I won't go there now, because that's my own personal problem with my own bank. Anyway, Teju, one of the, we've already heard from Gerald earlier on, but it was authentication, MFA strategies and different strengths of them. Perhaps I would invite you to talk about what you think some specific types of MFA methods are that are considered more secure than others. People have commented about the strength of biometrics, for example. Do you think they are secure enough? And do you think there's any particular strength of authentication methods that would meet particular regulatory requirements, like GDPR and Mexico's new emerging data protection legislation?
Yeah, so very similar thoughts as what Jared was saying. So basically, forms of multi-factor authentication have different levels of assurance associated with them. So in the past, we've seen like legacy factors like, like security question, SMS, OTP, voice OTP, and unfortunately, those are still actually widely used today, especially in consumer applications. You may notice that one of the main ways to get back into your account is through a security question. But there's definitely some obvious issues with security questions, like remembering the answer for one thing, and using the same security question across all your applications. So as users are using both the same password question across all applications, that presents issues. And then SMS and voice OTP, a little bit more, definitely more secure, but still has some issues with security in terms of like a form of man-in-the-middle attack, basically through phishing, basically identifying your phone number and sending a fake OTP. So then what we really want to get to is phishing-resistant methods of authentication. So that's where the whole FIDO 2.0 and WebAuthn comes into play. So you probably heard of FIDO 1 or what was called U2F, and that was kind of the first phase in implementing security tokens that were also meant to be more phishing resistant than other forms of multi-factor authentication. But now that we have FIDO 2.0, it'll be much easier for one, because many FIDO 2.0 factors are also biometric factors. So for example, if you're using a new MacBook that has the touch bar on it, that's actually considered a FIDO 2.0 factor, and you can actually use that to deliver both a secure and a passwordless experience for users. Also, Windows Hello on Windows 10, officially now a FIDO 2.0 factor. There's also some other hard tokens out there that do provide both biometrics and are also FIDO 2.0 compliant. So in terms of new authenticators that you want to deploy, definitely look to do FIDO 2.0 factors, whether that's built natively into the device or roaming authenticators like we call hard tokens. And then also mobile devices have their own FIDO 2.0 factors built into them. So if you have an Android device, for example, many of the more recent Android devices are now also FIDO 2.0 compliant through the Touch ID. That should be available for iOS soon as well with Face ID. And so, yeah, overall, I would say biometric factors are definitely the way to go, not just for security, but also just for a more seamless login experience for end users, whether that's on your employees or even for consumers.
Thanks for that, Teju. And I think it leads nicely into the question I was going to ask Gerard, because you didn't mention it at all. That's the whole issue of passwordless authentication, or frictionless authentication, I think is what we're talking about. We've heard about this for years, but there seems to be increasing momentum around this, Gerard. So why now? And what can we realistically expect in the near term?
Yeah, I think what we're going to expect near term is still going to be using passwords, and that's the obvious one, unfortunately. But the reality is that when we talk about, I would sort of demystify it, because passwordless means a lot of things to a lot of people. Now, passwordless technology has been around for many, many years now. Like, everybody has created their own scheme of passwordless. But what we see passwordless today is really like, how do we actually collaborate on a sort of a single mechanics, the protocol. And that's where the work that we've started with FIDO U2F and now FIDO 2 web authentication really is sort of, we believe, the future. Why? Because it is not just a passwordless technology that is implemented by one vendor. It is a passwordless standard, we call it, that can really scale. And what that means is that, as Teju mentioned, if that's available on every modern computing device that you bought, it would be foolish as a company not to leverage what's already there if you can achieve that user experience. So for us, passwordless is also a journey. We're not going to get rid of it again right away. But the technologies around that protocol and the technology around how people implement it is finally coming to a point of scale. And that means that if you look at the operating system vendors, Google, Microsoft, even Apple, moving very closely behind, not exactly there, but almost there, it gives a lot of weight to how enterprises deploy authentication methods. And it's very important to understand that, they actually save money as well while being secure, because you can think about all the current methods that you do. You have to install clients, extensions to get the best, whatever technology that you want for passwordless. Those all go away. If you bought the modern computers, the modern mobile phones, they all come built in. And so now you build your entire model around authenticating the devices through the apps, through the browsers, whatever access points that you have, because you can now authenticate them strongly in a very frictionless way. But I want to also call out that while we all agree that biometrics is important to grow the ecosystem for convenience and easier, there's also sort of like signal points on where sometimes you need biometrics in something else. It's a layered approach as well. So as we think about biometrics, you need to think about this scenario where you actually might want to challenge the user for both a biometric because you care, convenience, but then you also might say, you still need to put in, say, for example, a PIN, for example. So we need to think about those layered approaches as well, because I think it gives maximum flexibility depending on the type of assurance level that the organization wants. Say, for example, a federal government agency actually may need high assurance, and they may want to step things up even more than biometric. So it really gives a maximum coverage from our perspective.
Absolutely, Gerard, and I think you're absolutely right. The one thing to take away is that authentication isn't a single path. It has to be risk assessed, and you have to have the right level of assurance and solution you need for the assets and information or people you're protecting. So thank you very much indeed for that. So we're now reaching the end of the webinar. So I thank everyone for listening in, and I thank my panelists immensely for the excellent conversation we had. But before we end, well, I'll quickly go around the table to allow them to each of the panelists to give some final remarks and takeaway recommendations. And I'm going to start with you, Teju. Please, can you give us your takeaway recommendation and any other closing remarks you may have for today's listeners?
Yeah, sure. So I've just included a couple of links here, but just the main recommendation is something that we've all kind of mentioned already as panelists, is basically to start with the basics. I think someone mentioned that phishing is still the primary method of stolen credentials. We know that 81% of all data breaches, maybe even a little more than 81%, is caused by like stolen credentials. So think about the basics like phishing, password spray attacks, credential stuffing, and how you can stop those before you move on to more advanced topics. And then the other items that are listed here just have some examples of how Okta has helped other customers with single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, lifecycle management, as well as some other topics around passwordless.
Teju, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for your contribution today. Next up, Gerard, can you give us your takeaways, please?
Yeah, takeaways. Make sure that you evaluate your multi-factor authentication solution you have in place if you implemented one. Not everything is as mentioned at the bar that you may expect it to be. We talked about user experience, making sure that the multi-factor authentication solution that you select is very usable. I think you need to consider that day one, not put user experience as the last thing on the checkbox. And if you haven't got yourself involved with understanding what is capable with Vital and web authentication, I would encourage you to review. We've got a couple of takeaway and useful links for the readers and the audience to review and see the value of that. Thank you.
Gerard, thank you. That's excellent insights there. Thank you, and thanks for your contribution. Andy, over to you for your closing thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for those that were unfamiliar with Zero Trust, for those that were just learning about it, lots of new information out there. Actually, Richard and I are together at a working group for the Identity Defined Security Alliance today and tomorrow. We're working on a Zero Trust white paper that comes out at the Identityverse conference coming up. You know, check out these links here. We have plenty of information also on the Centrify website.
Andy, thank you. Richard, you're not least, but you are last, I'm afraid. Can you leave our listeners with something for your thoughts today?
Absolutely, and I think it dovetails nicely with a question that I saw pop up relative to not hearing about any new solutions during the webcast. You know, the webcast here specifically was around these higher tier concepts and where Zero Trust and where other forms of identity-centric security solutions are going. But if you look at the roadmap that was just up, all of the spaces within the context of the question that was asked, where is the new technology being developed for digital transformation and DevOps and automation, artificial intelligence? It is in all the intersects that are on this screen right here. And not only is my company, but the members of the Identifying Security Alliance are all either working on capabilities or have capabilities in place now to do things like continuous data-driven authentication. I think the real reason that we've seen so much challenge relative to identity is because it has been treated as a secondary control for so long that now that it is taking center stage, it's a new paradigm, as we mentioned earlier, a new way of thinking of putting that human being in the center of our information security architecture. And I've seen more innovation in the last 2 years than I've seen in the prior 10. And I'd leave that.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you again for my panelists. Again, that was absolutely superb discussion and conversation. I trust everyone out there enjoyed it. Kelly, over to you.
Okay, thanks for a really good discussion today, everyone, and thank you to our attendees for your participation. Please take a moment to leave us a rating and feedback, and be sure to scroll down to submit this in your console. We value your feedback, and we always take it into consideration when we're planning for future events. For those of you who qualify for CPE credit, your certificate of completion will be issued within 30 days. I'd like to remind those listening to check out our supporting resources and upcoming CPE programs related to today's topic by visiting www.executivitforums.org, where you can access our resources for free. Our next CPE webinar is being held on June 27th, an executive's guide to smarter GRC with cybersecurity attack analytics, and you can reserve your seat now through the console. So that's it for today. I'd like to thank our speakers for your participation, with a special thanks to our sponsors, Yubico, Okta, Ping Identity, and Centrify, without whom this event would not be possible. And of course, thank you once again to our attendees for listening. Please stay tuned for our next event, and have a great day, everyone.